carrying on our series this morning, looking at the life of Moses from Exodus. And in the space of one verse, we've jumped 40 years in the life of Moses. He's gone from being that baby placed in the River Nile to being a 40-year-old man living in Pharaoh's palace. He was a real life prince of Egypt. He'd been well educated. He was now trained, fully trained as a soldier. There was talk of him being trained up to be the next Pharaoh. He'd proved himself in battles. He'd led the Egyptian army to victory. And he was used to being listened to. He lived a life of opulence and luxury. By the time he was 40, he would have looked like an Egyptian. He would have talked like an Egyptian. He probably even walked like an Egyptian. But let's jump into today's passage and we'll see what happens, because as you'll see, very speedily things go very wrong for our Moses. So Exodus 2 verse 11 says this. It says, "One day after Moses grew up, he went out to where his own people were and he watched them at their hard labour. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people." So although Moses had lived like an Egyptian and been taught like an Egyptian, he knew who he was. He knew he was a Hebrew. And here he is completely identifying with the plight of these Hebrew slaves. But unfortunately, his next action defines the next 40 years of his life. And as far as I can see, there wasn't any premeditation going on here. Moses just acts on instinct. Verse 12 says this. It says, "Looking this way and that and seeing nobody, he killed the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand." Did Moses set out to kill this Egyptian? I'm not sure he did. I mean, the fact that I think we know he was a great warrior meant that he was skillful in battle. But I'm not sure he went out with the intent to kill him. But did he know what he was doing was wrong? And I think the answer there is yes. You know, we see it recorded that he was looking around to make sure nobody was watching him, and then he hid the body in the sand. Moses definitely wasn't led by God here. He took it upon himself. He enacted Operation Deliverance as he saw the best way to do it. Because I know that Moses knew that he was special, and he recognised that he was still a Hebrew, and he was concerned about the plight of the Hebrew people, and that moved him to action. And these are all good motives. However, Acts 7 verse 25 says this. It says, "Moses thought his own people would recognise God was using him to rescue them, but they did not." Moses had seen 2 and 2 and come up with 6. It got him into a whole lot of trouble. And I do wonder how often we do the same kind of thing, barge into situations without the guiding of the Holy Spirit. How often do we enact our own Operation Deliverance in one form or another? Because ultimately, when we're doing God's work, if we're doing it purely in human effort, we'll always fail. It makes no difference how well intentioned we are. Without the guiding and the leading of the Holy Spirit, we're set up to fail from the off, really, aren't we? So verse 13 to 15 goes on to say this. It says, "The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, 'Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?' And the man said, 'Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?' And then Moses was afraid and thought, 'What I did must have become known.' When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down at a well." And it's so sad, isn't it, that Moses ends up so far away from where he's grown up. He's a stranger in a strange land, thousands of miles away from Egypt. And he stops at a well, which is not unusual given that that's a place where thirsty people come to drink. And it's there he meets this group of sisters. And as has happened previously, Moses then ends up having to defend them, and he finds favour with them and with their dad. Moses finds a home, he finds acceptance and a new family in Midian. One of these sisters goes on to be his wife, and he starts his own family with her. And it's really clear that God loved and cared for Moses in the midst of this utter failure. Moses was not forgotten. And I don't think it was a coincidence either that he stopped at this well. During this year, time and time again, I've been brought back to Psalm 46 verse 10 that says, "Be still and know that I am God." And what I want to ask this morning is, are we thirstier than we think we are? Do we need to stop and be still? Do we need to take a long drink from the life-giving water that the Holy Spirit gives? Do we need to learn in the craziness of everything that's happening currently to be still and recognise God? But Moses then goes on to spend the next 40 years working as a shepherd. And actually this is probably a really good training ground for him as he learns to lead these stubborn sheep to pasture. I'm sure God was preparing him for leading his special flock, Israel, to the promised land, because they too were stubborn and didn't want to listen. But I'm absolutely sure that Moses must have felt terrible in Midian. He must have felt ashamed, embarrassed. I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't think that his life was over and that God would never use him. I wonder if he just resigned himself to the day job. But in all this, another 40 years passed, and it seemed like God was doing nothing. There was a whole generation of Hebrews who grew up in slavery. And so it's not only Moses who I think would have felt abandoned by God. The whole Hebrew people must have felt like God just wasn't listening. But I love the end of this passage. Verse 23 to 25 says this. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And so God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. God remembered his covenant. God doesn't break his promises. But as with so many things in life, there are no easy fixes. Exodus shows us the reality of that, doesn't it? But I want this to be a real encouragement for us today, that when life is difficult, when the prevailing wind is towards darkness in our lives, we need to persevere. We need to be faithful and patient with God, because he will move. And it's reminded me I am a complete and utter coffee lover. And on the mornings that I have more time, I make myself proper coffee. Now, proper coffee is so much better than instant, but it takes more time. There's no quick fix. And God is always at work to bring us out of darkness. And the end product, like the proper coffee that tastes better than the instant, The end product is always better than any quick fix. And I was really encouraged as well this week when there was a story that was shared by someone in church who'd been praying for his brother for years and years and years, and he's finally given his life to Jesus. I'm absolutely sure there must have been times when they thought God was not listening, when they thought he would never move. But God has moved, and God will move. Exodus encourages us to hang on in there, to dig deep. I wonder if some of you feel discouraged, that God doesn't see you, that some of the harsh things that have happened to you just don't register on God's radar. Maybe some of you have even thought, does God even care about me? And I want to say today, that is a complete and utter lie of the devil. Because God is always aware and he cares deeply for all of us. You've only got to read Psalm 139. He knit you together in your mother's womb. He knows when you lie down and when you stand up. He's familiar with all your ways. God will always deliver his people, but it might not be in our time frame. It might not be in the manner that we expect, but we need to trust that God will always act. And maybe like Moses, your life has felt a little bit haphazard. Maybe you've done stuff that's left you feeling ashamed, unworthy, untrained, ungifted. Maybe you've actually disqualified yourself from being able to serve God. But your life is absolutely no accident. Who you are, what has happened to you, no matter how bad your failures are, if God has called you to something, you are exactly the right person for the job. Moses was a Hebrew, removed from his family, brought up in Egyptian royalty. He was a murderer, and he ended up being banished and running away from his Egyptian home. He spent 40 years looking after sheep, but God used him mightily to rescue a whole nation. And as I've prepped, I really felt like there may well be somebody who's resigned themselves to the day job, who previously has had a really clear calling from God, but stuff's happened. They've had to run away. But I wonder today whether God's calling you back into your true destiny in him. I want to finish by reading this quote by Hudson Taylor about pressure. It says this: "There will always be pressure in life. It doesn't matter how great the pressure is. What matters is whether the pressure comes between you and God or whether it pushes you closer to him." And so today, be encouraged. God is always at work, even if it looks like we can't see that. He can use even our most dire failures to achieve his purposes. My prayer today is that when life applies its pressure to us, as it always will, that pressure drives us closer to a God who loves and cares for us, rather than separating us away from him. Amen.